when it comes to freelancing, you can pick and choose whether you want to do a project or not. You're not answerable to anyone. You don't have to get involved in office politics. You can take a holiday if you want to. You can choose to change the direction of your career anytime you want. But of course, the downside of that is the uncertainty.
Hey Hatchlings, welcome to the first ever episode of the Motion Hatch podcast. I'm your host, Hayley Akins. Today on the show we have Lilian Darmono, who's an art director originally from Melbourne, Australia. Now her episodes are split into two parts, so please do make sure you listen to both part 1 and part 2. In the first episode we talk about how she got into art directing for motion design, and also a bit about the differences between creative direction and art direction. And in part 2 we cover things more like pricing, what you should be charging, what questions you need to ask before you begin working on a project with your client, and also the importance of always having a contract. So please enjoy the episodes. Hey Lilian, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I just wanted to start by asking you how you became an art director for animation.
Sure. Basically, my journey is a bit of a roundabout way. So I studied graphic design at university, and the final year of that was a little bit of an exposure to the world of multimedia. That's what the whole thing was called back then. This was maybe around 2002. So there was a whole year dedicated to Flash and After Effects and things like that. So that's my first exposure to the world of motion graphics. And after university, I graduated and started working as a motion graphics designer at this place called Illura in Melbourne, which is the only large-scale visual effects house at that time back in Melbourne in Australia. And after a few years of that, I moved on to do broadcast design at another company called Z Space in Sydney. And after a few years in Sydney, I moved to London to try and travel and work at the same time. And round about this time was when the GFC, the global financial crisis, hit. So this was around 2008. I arrived in London sometime around September, October 2008. And at that time, there was very little work. So it sort of drove me a little bit crazy because, you know, sitting around in a flat and not really having a lot of money to go out. London, as you know, is a very expensive city, and there's not a lot of work going on. So I decided to just do a personal project of doing a digital painting based on a new technique that I wanted to learn. So at that time, I've just recently joined Motionographer as a contributor, and I met this really talented guy called John Saunders, and I looked through his work, and he had a few really interesting looking style frames where basically it's sort of like almost like a faux 3D. So there's a bit of a 2D, 3D thing going on. And I asked him how he did that. And he was very generous. He shared me his Photoshop files that sort of gave me an insight of how you build layers in Photoshop with textures and shading and things like that. So I decided to learn a little bit of that by making my own digital painting. If you have a look at my website, there's a painting section, and there is one under digital painting called Dusk, which shows a big bird that's sort of like perched on a cliff. And I sort of did that as a way to pass the time, just to keep myself creatively occupied. The whole thing probably took me about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, doing it really, really slowly. And once I finished that, I put it up on my site, and then I sent my site around again. And coincidentally, a few people saw that and wanted a similar technique in terms of making a style frame, which has a lot of Photoshop collage and sort of this texture look going on, like a fake 3D look going on. So that's my first entry into the world of style framing and art direction, really. So out of a personal project, other projects came up. I ended up doing more and more style frame at that time. Most of my clients were American studios who wanted to do different directions in terms of pitching. And from then on, I started doing less and less actual animating on After Effects. And yeah, a few years later is how I somehow ended up doing no longer animation or motion design or motion graphics and just focusing on the art direction side.
So was it a conscious decision to become an art director, or was it more the need just to work on something and then put it out there, and the feedback you got was that people wanted you to work on those kind of things for them and then get someone else to do the animation?
It was a little bit of both, because the term art director itself is very loose. When it comes to the world of animation, I find that animation and motion graphics, our friends in the States use it to refer to that stage in the production where the look of the project gets decided before the animation actually begins. Whereas elsewhere around the world, it seems like it refers more to the fact that you're supervising a team of people rather than just you yourself making style frames. So there's a bit of a difference in terms of definition. But for me, at that stage was when I realized that I enjoy the process of creating beautiful illustrations and frames much more than getting up something that is perfectly animated done. I mentioned earlier on, around that time, 2008, 2009, I joined Motionographer as a contributor. And because of that, it opened me up to other contributors, getting to know them and getting to know a few amazing animators, such as this woman by the name of Michelle Higa, who is now a really good friend and a respected colleague, and knowing how much effort and research and patience goes into her process of making something perfectly animated, it sort of humbled me and made me feel that this is really not what I want to do. This is really not my forte. I should leave this to people who are more talented than me in that respect. And I would do the other side that I would obsess over, which is the look of something. And that's how I became an art director.
So do you think that maybe it's something that people should think about when they get into motion design and animation, like which bit of the process they enjoy? And if they enjoy that part of it, do you think it's something they could get into, or do you think it's easier to do animations, you know, from start to finish yourself and then maybe progress into that later on?
I really think it depends on where you are. Coming from Australia as a person that starts in the world of animation and motion graphics, the business is really small over there. So really, in order to get hired and to stay competitive, you have to be a Jill of all trades. So you have to know different styles. You have to be able to execute different stages of the production yourself as a one-man person, or have a variety of skills under your belt. And specialization is not really profitable over there because generally it needs a really big industry such as the one you have in the US and Europe, where you can make a decent living just by being a specialist in one thing, either, an art director, or say you only do lighting and rendering in big post-production places and so on and so forth. And I guess it really depends on the style of animation and the style of work that you want to pursue. But also another layer of that is it depends on the kind of person you are. If you want to be a specialist in something, obviously it takes a lot of hours and dedication and effort. And another side of that is you have to have the ability to shut off the other sides of the production and accept that you can't be good at everything. And instead you just pursue this one slice, sometimes a very narrow slice of the production pie, and get obsessively good at it. So if you have the type of personality that enjoys that and can ignore or sort of, shut out the rest of the scene, then that will be something that's good for you to do. But if you're like me, where I like a little bit of everything, I think it would not have been possible or satisfying for me to start out as an art director. I need to try all the different sides of production first before narrowing down my focus. And I have to say, because I'm the kind of person that liked many different things, it took a long time for me to even find that part of myself and realize that this is what I am, this is who I really am. Because as I said earlier, I studied graphic design because at that time I did not know how else to make a living by being a creative due to lack of exposure and lack of understanding of what careers are available out there as a creative person. I certainly did not know that you can make a living out of being an illustrator. There's, very little information available at that time. It was pre so-called broadband internet back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So for me, it was a bit of a trial and error, and it took a long meandering road to finally realize that this is not for me, this is not for me, this is not for me, that is not for me. So for me, it was a process of, canceling out things rather than going wholeheartedly into one aspect. So to reiterate, it really depends on who you are, where you're based, how you plan to make a living out of your craft, and just be open to, the fact that you're not necessarily the same kind of person as the person next to you, and explore different, combinations of how to make a living in this craft, really.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it helps you stand out because you have had that animation experience, but obviously you're a very skilled illustrator? I know when we worked together before, it was really helpful to know, how the animation process works. So you kind of think about that when you're working on your illustrations and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spoken to different illustrators that have more of a traditional illustration exposure. So in the world of illustration, generally, it's divided into things that are most expensive or things that pay the most to things that pay the least. This is what I've been told anyway by an industry expert who's also a portfolio consultant I met through the AOI. She said that the entry level generally would be things that pay the least, such as publications, books, magazines, and things like that. And things that pay the most would be advertising, so massive billboards and an illustration that would appear everywhere. So in that traditional illustration model, animation is not a part of that at all. However, increasingly, what I observe is more and more production companies or advertising agencies or even experience design agencies are reaching out to traditional illustrators, yet they're quite frustrated because not many traditional illustrators know the workflow of animation. And that is quite a challenge for them because eventually what they need is to turn these illustrations into animation. So yes, in that regard, having a skill like myself is a really unique selling point. But the other side of that is the challenge of marketing myself, the challenge of making people understand that this is what I do. And it's challenging because out there, it is not a well-known segment yet, that there are these illustrators who are called, quote unquote, art directors in animation who don't execute animations ourselves, but we understand the flow of animation and are able to art direct 3D artists and 2D animation artists and compositors and people within the traditional animation or motion graphics pipeline that can execute illustrations really well. So it's a double-edged sword in a way, because yes, you have a unique skill and that is a selling point, but the downside of that is it's quite tricky because people don't know that such a category exists. Often I have to correct clients saying, actually, just to be clear, I don't know how to animate anymore. I can't execute this into a piece of animation in the time frame and a reasonable budget that you need because I am not an animator anymore. And they will be taken aback. They'll be like, oh, actually, I thought you would be. Because obviously there's a lot of people out there who can do both. So yeah, it's a tricky balance. It can be a unique selling point, but it can also be difficult. So it's a bit of both.
Yeah. Do you have any particular advice for if someone was an animator now and they wanted to get more into art directing?
My first piece of advice would be knowing how to talk to people really well. Because in my experience, a lot of artists who do not need a team to execute a final product, like a lot of people from our field don't have the capability or don't have the desire to work as part of a team. That would be the first thing that they need to brush up on, is not just people skills, but ability to communicate and motivate other people, because that itself is quite a skill that you need to practice and learn and sort of perfect over the years. Often it's about being perceptive enough to other people that you understand how their brain works, because there are many, many different ways of communicating the same thing. There are many, many different types of personalities out there that you're required to work with. So, my advice would be that needs to be something you're comfortable with. Once you're comfortable with people, dealing with people on a constant basis, communicating to them, explaining things to them, and helping them out. When somebody comes to you and like, okay, what do you want this to look like? It could be a lot harder than you first imagined to get that message across. You might have to think on your feet. You might have to pull references from many, many different sources. You might have to rely on sketching something yourself or typing notes in a certain way that is easy to understand. Whatever it is, that will be the first thing I would look at if you want to be an art director, is the communication skill and the ability to help other people to understand what your vision is going to be like. The actual skill of executing style frames or making illustrations itself, I would say, comes second.
Yeah, I agree. I think as we get older and our industry gets a bit older, I think people are more looking to get into the leadership and director kind of roles. Do you think that's true?
I think that is more of a perception that people have. A while ago, I think Joey Korenman wrote an article for Motionographer about Too Old for MoGraph. And in it, he talks about possible career outcomes for people in the industry as they get older, and they want to be more in control of their fate, and they no longer want to be just working under someone else's command, so to speak. In a way, that is a bit of an illusion, I feel, that no matter where you are, no matter how high up you get, you will never be completely free from the chains of working under someone else's command or wishes, because ultimately that's what your client is. Whoever it is that pays for the job or pays for your wages, that would be your boss. That would be the person who you're responsible to, and I think if you're a young person, you're a young designer out there starting out, it might seem like a very tempting scenario to climb the ladder, get into a position of leadership, and sort of, no longer be the humble worker in the production line. But much to my, dissatisfaction, when I did climb the ladder and get higher in the process, the higher you are, the more responsibilities you have, and the scarier and the more stressful your position becomes. Because what happens if you're a leader in a project, if you are a good leader, that is, if the project doesn't turn out well, somebody will be looking for someone to blame. The client would want someone to blame. That's how human minds are. And that person will be you. You're in charge. Why didn't you do this better? You're in charge. Why did the team fall apart? It looks really different when you're in a position down below, when you're a subordinate, that, of course the boss gets to go home early. Of course the boss gets to tell people what to do. But if you're really a responsible art director or creative director at the top, it's a very stressful position, because when you are in charge, everybody looks to you for guidance. Everybody looks to you to tell them what to do. What do you want? What do you want us to do? What would the outcome of this project be? What is the vision here? And when people get upset and stressed and they're no longer working to their best ability, that is partly also your fault, So I feel like that's a bit of a seductive, dare I say, illusion that is only true if you are on the outside. Once you're on the inside, climbing the ladder is definitely not making things better. And another thing that I should say as well is this is a reason why I'm an art director and not a creative director, because I've tried that role. And what I found is that a creative director would need to do much more face-to-face client time, whether you're meeting the client or you're explaining to the client what's happening or selling the idea to a client. And the more you're in that role, the less time you have of creating the artwork itself. So if you're the kind of person who's like me, I really absolutely love the process of creating artworks and beautiful frames and illustrations by myself, undisturbed, on the computer with my headphones on, whether I'm playing a podcast or a music, and just being left alone. The higher you climb, the less likely that would be a reality for you. This was certainly the case when I was art directing a project with Google Digital Garage, where there were 14 animators that I was supervising and 4 other illustrators. I hardly had a continuous 40 minutes undisturbed. Every time I sit down, I put on my headphones and I start working on a piece of illustration. I would start the timer. And at the end of the project, I found that the longest stretch of undisturbed period was 45 minutes. So if you're the kind of person that really enjoys that process, there's a certain, sacrifice you have to make if you want to be in the leadership positions, that you don't get to spend that time enjoying yourself creating things in peace. And I have friends who are creative directors of companies that complain that they end up answering emails more than actually making anything creative. And to me, that's quite a stressful situation to be in, certainly not for everyone.
I think it's really important to try and distinguish, the roles of an art director and a creative director, because sometimes, like you were saying, people in different countries use the terms in different ways and things like that. And also, I think Joey's article was really, really interesting because we are quite a young industry, but then, people are getting a bit older and kind of thinking, oh, where do I go now? What do I do next? Do you think there's more freedom in freelance compared to working in a studio?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when it comes to freelancing, you can pick and choose whether you want to do a project or not. You're not answerable to anyone. You don't have to get involved in office politics. You can take a holiday if you want to. You can choose to change the direction of your career anytime you want. But of course, the downside of that is the uncertainty, because you're not on a salary, obviously. And it would always be a little bit more nerve-wracking than your other friends who are in a full-time position when things are quiet, because basically you're responsible for finding your own work and making sure that money comes in.
Yeah. Do you have any tips in particular for when you have quiet times of how you get clients and how you connect with them and things like that?
Sure. I always find it useful to send emails when things are quiet, send emails to people in my contact list and say, hi, I'm available again from this period to that period. Check out my site. I've just updated it with this or that project. And also generally, I find it a lot more reassuring as the years go by to look back. I find it really a good practice to keep a bit of a diary in terms of when things are quiet, when things are busy. So over the years, you can observe some sort of trend going on that generally now, having freelance since about 2008, almost 10 years now, it's become quite obvious that between December to February, things will be quiet. And again, between July to August, or even June to August sometimes, depending on the weather, depending on where you are, obviously, because I find that in the UK, for instance, a lot of people go on summer holidays and projects tend to wind down. In Australia, we have summer in December until February, and basically nobody really works for the entire month of January. So there will be that busy time when things ramp up just before Christmas, as people want to produce Christmas related ads or products or explainers or whatever before the office closes at the year end. So right after that will be when things taper off. So you know that after the holidays, things will be quiet, and then you need to plan in advance. What are you going to do at that time? Is it take the time to learn a new skill, hit up a few tutorials online, or look into a new area that you've always been interested in, whether it's learning a new 3D skill or a new medium in traditional painting. Say you've always wanted to do an oil painting, and now might be a good time. Or maybe you want to go off on holiday with your family, or you want to start a family or have a baby or whatever it is. Again, it really depends on how busy your year has been. If your year has been a really hectic one, then it might be time to just give yourself a rest, which makes sure that you will come back much more productive because you're well rested. If your year has been sort of like a little bit off because there's a few disruption, who knows, maybe there's been an illness in the family, or politically Brexit happened, or Trump happened, or whatever, and things are a little bit less productive than before, then maybe to keep yourself motivated and positive, it's time to start a personal project, or time to collaborate with somebody, or learn a new skill, like I said, or start an Instagram or series of 100 days of characters, 100 days of flower paintings, or whatever it is, So again, it really depends on who you are. Don't feel pressurized because everybody in your social network is doing a personal project, that you need to do a personal project yourself. You not necessarily have to. And health is, again, the most important thing, because if you're not healthy, everything else can forget about it. Everything else will just fall apart. So look after your health first. And if things are quiet, if your health is okay, then take on something else by all means. If you're trying to drum up work when things are quiet, send emails to your usual suspects, because it is always better to freelance for someone that already know and trust you than to hit up new clients, obviously. So once you've hit up people that you normally freelance for, if there's still nothing, then you hit up new possibilities, whether you do a little bit of research on LinkedIn or posting something on Twitter saying that, hey, I'm available for freelance, hashtag it with the appropriate words, whether it's hashtag illustration, hashtag animation, motion design, or art direction, whatever it is. And just keep yourself open to new opportunities. If that doesn't bring anything, then maybe go out with friends and see if, keep your ear on the ground. Ask your friends from the industry to keep their ears on the ground, see if anyone's hiring. Is there anything interesting cooking? But, just basically do everything. And it is always useful to keep a list. And if there is someone new that contacted you that you've never spoken to before, always ask them, after thanking them for getting in touch with you, ask them, if you don't mind me asking, how did you hear about me? That way you can keep track of what methods out of the list that you have, whether it's posting an update on LinkedIn or Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is, what method has given you the most returns.
There's so much good advice in there. I think, having personal projects that you do, and then that obviously influences your work that you might get next. So if you're trying to move into a different style, say, then I think it's good to maybe do a personal project in that style that you would like to show your clients. And then obviously keeping track of all your clients and everything. And I like what you said about keeping track of how they found you. I haven't thought of doing that before. I think that's a really valuable thing that we can do. And also, keeping track of when the quiet periods come. So maybe, okay, I should go on holiday in January and then work really hard in December because I know that maybe there's not as many projects around usually. I think that's all really great advice, actually. That was really great. Thanks so much to Lilian for coming on the show. She also has a part 2, which is just episode 2 of the Motion Hatch podcast. So please do go over and listen to that, because we talk more about pricing and we talk about why you should always have a contract with your client. And that was just really, really insightful and helpful. So if you want to go and listen to that, please do. And also, if you could just do me one big favor before you do that, if you could go to iTunes and leave us a rating and review, and also subscribe, because that helps show the podcast to more people. And I really, really want to get this podcast out there to help more people be better at doing business in motion design and animation. So that would be great. If you want to know more about Motion Hatch, you can go to motionhatch.com. And if you sign up to our newsletter, I'll add you to our free Facebook community, where we're having this conversation and talking more about the business side of motion design and animation. So that would really be great to have you in there as well. All right, thanks. Bye.